make sure that you think about your questions. Let's try to put Dr. Taaffe on the spot. I have seen several of his lectures online, and Q&A has occurred, and he's never been stumped yet, so we'll expect him to do that here. At the end of this program, we're going to put the screen up, and those of you who are here as guests who've never been to the Audie Murphy Museum or never toured the Audie Murphy portion of the museum, it's behind us. And you're welcome to do that after this program is over. At the same time, we have a limited number of books. The Dr. Taaffe, the book about Marshall, and we have a limited number of them out there. And he will be glad to autograph them, to personally autograph them for you. And I'm sure he'd be happy to have his picture made with you if you want them. So there's a limited number, and as soon as the program is over, he will go out there, and you need to go out at that point in time and purchase the book. I think it's $27, pay for it at the cash register, and they take credit cards. Within your program that you have in front of you is a printed program insert. We would deeply appreciate it if you would fill that out and turn it in as you leave. It tells us your views and thoughts about Dr. Taaffe's presentation. It asks you what you think of our 24 program of speakers, and whether you think that's a good list or not that we're going to have, and any suggestions you might have for future programs that the Roundtable can do. I want to also introduce to you John Scruggs. Hold your hand up, John. John and the person that's going to introduce, and Skip Steely, who's going to introduce Dr. Taaffe, are the co-chairs of our programs committee for the Roundtable. It is that group that selects the speakers, or at least does the work on gathering information about the speakers, and then recommends that list to the board of directors. So if you have any thoughts that you want to express directly, why Skip and John are the ones to visit with here. Additional members of the committee who couldn't be here tonight: Dr. Keith McFarland, the President Emeritus of Texas A&M Commerce, who was former head of the History Department at Texas A&M, and he's also the President Emeritus of Texas A&M Commerce. He has a family in Colorado, and he needed to get up there and see them. Dr. Sharon Kowalski, that I mentioned previously, she's the head of the History Department of Commerce. She's on this programs committee also. Now, let me mention a couple other things. Our goals for 2024, 4 programs, perhaps one or more to be added to that. And again, you have that list in front of you. Audie Days is coming up next spring. It is a program in the museum. It is possible that we will be able to attract an internationally known historian to be a part of Audie Days. If we're able to do that, the Roundtable will co-sponsor this with the museum. It is our intent throughout this year to gather 400 names into a master contact list of people interested in World War II. With other publicity we're doing and a master contact list of 400 names, we can keep you informed of what's going on with the Roundtable. With that, I think I'm going to take a minute or two and introduce you to Skip Steely. Skip is a Paris, Texas resident. 1968, 1970 graduate of East Texas State University, where according to him, he subsequently took so many history courses, they shut the door on him in 1983 for a lack of a 3rd degree plan. So, by that time, he was deep into his 4th history book and 1st book on sports. Since then, he has written, edited, or published over 30 books on early Texas pioneers, along with 2 books on baseball great Eddie Robinson, and 5 on Admiral J.O. Richardson. If you're truly into World War II, you've heard of J.O. Richardson. a native of Paris, Texas. It's the reason Skip wrote about him. He was the commander of the Pacific Fleet before Admiral Kimmel was appointed. And he was one who told President Roosevelt he shouldn't put the Pacific Fleet out of Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands. He wrote the book about the man. He also wrote a book on someone from Greenville, Texas that most of you have never heard about, but he's a true hero. He died in battle. His name was Dean Hallmark. Dean Hallmark was a part of the Doolittle raid on Tokyo. He lost his life in the process. Skip wrote the book. Skip, please come up here and introduce Dr. Taaffe. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Carrier, what do you think about that? It all started with you, Texas history. When I was asked to study Dr. Taaffe of Stephen F. Austin University, now a branch of the University of Texas, as one of our first speakers, I noticed that he had 4 children, and when I called him, he quickly accepted. And he said that he and his wife Cynthia would like a break from a busy house. Well, I watch Sheldon, young Sheldon, each evening, so I can kind of imagine what a busy house is. The subject of George Cabot Marshall intrigues me. I don't know much about him, only a couple of things. Really, he assigned a Paris, Texas girl to Hawaii at Christmas of 1940. She was married to General Walter C. Sharp. Her first cousin was Mrs. J.O. Richardson, her husband being the Navy Fleet Commander, who was stuck in temporary orders at Honolulu. The women were really excited. They had never been assigned to the same place before. So Marshall was on their top list. And then at the Pearl Harbor congressional hearings in early 1946, or late 1945, Marshall said, "I don't know," 32 times when quizzed about where he was and why he was so slow on December 7th to send a message to Hawaii. A lady sitting next to Isabel Dean Short leaned over and said, "Either he's a liar or the most incompetent person we've had for some time." In her unpublished memoirs, sitting out at the Hoover Institution Library at Stanford University, Isabel noted that General Marshall never wrote his memoirs because he was afraid to tell the real story. Well, you know, several World War II historians, 6 I think, that Steve thinks, have written and made a great effort to explain Marshall's positives, and he tells it best. He gives us a wonderful, fun look at the point of some 30-plus generals who worked under Marshall from 1941 to 1946. Stephen was born in Ohio. Cynthia, you were too, right? And he's taught history since graduating from Grove City College in Pennsylvania and gaining his PhD from Ohio University in 1995. He's been at Stephen F. Austin for nearly 23 years, specializing in military history. His latest of more than 10 books is about Marine Corps generals, published by the Navy Institute Press in 2021. How you write a book and teach at the same time is always pretty remarkable, or work. Perhaps now that SFA is part of the university system, they'll dole out some larger grants for more books. We set up, by the way, Cynthia and Stephen at the lofts on Lee Street so they could relax from that long drive. Their first trip to Greenville, and he'll give us a real story about Marshall. Steve, it's all yours. Thank you.
I appreciate you all having me here. I've never been to this part of Texas before. Not a lot of trees compared to East Texas. That's one thing I noticed. When you do one of these things, you're always supposed to start with some sort of joke or something like that, even if you don't have a sense of humor, which I don't. But nevertheless, I feel an obligation to start with a joke. And this is a joke that our preacher told in church, so if you don't like it, blame him. And when I told one of my colleagues the joke, he said, every Texan has heard this joke. But my students, when I told them, none of them had, so I'm going to use it anyway. And it's a story about a couple Texans who died, and unlike the vast majority of Texans, these two guys went to hell. And because it was so unusual for Texans to go to hell, the devil wanted to see these guys in action. So the devil went to that particular part of hell and noticed that the two Texans are just standing around and they seem fine and the heat doesn't seem to bother them at all, and that bothered the devil because they're supposed to be suffering. And he turned to his assistant and said, "What's up with these guys?" And the assistant devil said to the Prince of Darkness, said, well, they're Texans, so they're used to the heat. And the devil didn't like that one bit. He said, well, all right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to double the temperature. Let's jack it up to 5,000 degrees. I'll be back tomorrow, and we'll see these guys suffering. So the next day, the devil returned to that particular part of hell, and he walks in, and the two Texans are there barbecuing. And the devil says to his assistant, I cannot believe these guys aren't suffering. What's going on? And the assistant said, I told you, these guys are Texans. They're used to this kind of heat. Well, the devil thought about it and said, okay, here's what we'll do. Lower the temperature, 200 degrees below zero, and we'll see how they deal with that. I said, I'll come back tomorrow. So he came back the next morning, and sure enough, the Texans were there, but they're jumping up and down, and they're high-fiving each other. And the devil said to his assistant, what's going on? I lowered the temperature. Hell's frozen over. And the devil's assistant said, well, they think the Cowboys have just won the Super Bowl. I'm from Ohio, which means that I root for the Browns, so I resent any team that does better than the Browns, which is pretty much everybody. All right. So what I'm going to talk about tonight, and it'll take about a half hour, 40 minutes, I promise, is I'm going to talk about George Marshall. George Marshall was the commander of the entire American Army during World War II. He was what's called the Chief of Staff, and he held that position from 1939, the day World War II began in Europe, until 1945 at the end of the war. And I think Marshall's an important guy. In fact, I would make the argument, contrary to that Isabel lady, I would make the argument that George Marshall is one of the two most important American military leaders in American history. The only guy I think is more important than George Marshall would be George Washington. And there's a lot you can talk about with George Marshall because, again, he's an incredibly important guy, not only militarily, but he's later Secretary of State, won the Nobel Peace Prize. He's important for all sorts of reasons. But what I decided to do is I decided to look at Marshall and the men he selected to lead the high-level combat units in World War II. And I think it's an important subject, and I've got a couple reasons why I think it's so important. And the obvious one is this: an army is no more important than its commanders. An army is no better than its commanders. Even if you have great logistics, even if you have lots of resources, even if your troops are well armed, well trained, well equipped, if their commander's no good, you're probably not going to win the war. Okay? And the fact that Marshall was able to select such good high-level combat commanders, it tells you this. It shows that an army is no better than its commanders. So I think it's important to know a little bit about his relationship with his commanders for that reason. Second reason why I think this is important is because these guys that Marshall selected to lead these high-level combat units, they played a big role in the war's outcome. If you think of the Army in World War II as like a machine, these are the guys who operated the individual parts of the machine. And again, they had a huge impact on the war's outcome. And I can give you all sorts of examples, but I'll give you one brief one here. There's a general named Mark Clark. He commanded a field army in Italy during World War II. And at one point, he made this decision that instead of trying to destroy the German army in Italy, he wanted to capture Rome. He wanted to be the first guy to conquer Rome from the south for 400 years or something like that. And so he did that. He focused his efforts on capturing Rome, and the German army got away to fight another day. That's a momentous decision, had a big impact on the war, and it's a decision made by one of these guys who Marshall appointed, which again just shows you how important these men could be. And finally, the last reason I think it's important to talk about Marshall and his subordinate generals is this. It tells us something about the U.S. Army in the mid-20th century. Marshall tried to get a certain kind of officer to lead his combat units during the war. And the one thing that characterizes the guys that Marshall put in charge of these high-level units was really professionalism. He wanted professionals, by which I mean a bunch of guys who operated from a similar playbook. So I think the fact that these professionals were running the Army during World War II does tell us a little bit about the Army during that time. So I think it's important for those three reasons. Well, before I talk about how Marshall selected these high-level combat commanders, I think it's important to talk a little bit about Marshall himself. And keep in mind that the Army in World War II was a huge organization, the biggest the American Army has ever been. Let me give you some mindless statistics on this. When Marshall became Chief of Staff at the beginning of World War II, when it broke out in 1939, there were about 175,000 men in the Army. By the time World War II was over, there were 10.4 million men in the Army. By comparison, during the Civil War, the Union Army had a wartime peak of about 600,000 men. In World War I, the Army had a peak of about 3.4 million men. So it's a big, giant force. It dwarfs any army that the United States has had before or since. And that means that the Army during World War II was able to create these giant formations that it had never really had before and really hasn't had since. And that means it had, for example, 89 combat divisions. A division is a unit of about 15,000 men. There were 89 of these that the Army deployed during World War II. And the Army would take these divisions and group them into what are called corps. And there are about 20 of those in World War II. And then take these corps and organize them into field armies. Patton led a field army. And there were, I think, 9 of those in World War II. And even these field armies were grouped into this huge conglomeration called an army group, of which there were 2 or 3, depending on how you want to evaluate them, during World War II. So these are huge organizations. Again, never seen before, never seen since in the American Army. And it's Marshall's job to pick these guys. He's going to pick the guys who commanded the theaters, the army groups, the corps, even down to the divisions at some point. And Marshall is a guy who his personality is going to play a role in this. And I think there are a couple things to keep in mind about Marshall. One, to look at his character and personality. And then 2, to look at the way he did things, which helps us understand the guys he appointed to lead these units. And I want to start by talking a little bit about Marshall's personality, because it is, I think, kind of interesting. George Marshall was an admirable man in all sorts of ways. The word that people often use to describe George Marshall is he was an honorable man, which isn't a word people throw around all that much anymore. He impressed everyone with his sense of honor, his enormous integrity, his ability to cut to the heart of the matter, his professionalism, his dignity, and most of all, his ability to get things done. The Secretary of War, Marshall's civilian boss in the War Department, his name was Henry Stimson, he wrote about Marshall in his diary. And what Stimson wrote about Marshall is this. He wrote, quote, "Marshall towers above everybody else in the strength of his character and in the wisdom and tactfulness and handling himself and handling of his plan. He is by far the biggest man that I have met in Washington, and although as a loyal soldier he does not seek exhibitions of his qualities as a civil character, yet he has them. He is selfless, tactful, careful in his detail work of planning, very conciliatory in negotiations, and yet capable of terrific force in carrying through a decision that he has fully made up his mind about." So again, honorable man, but there was also a certain cold-bloodedness to him. He could seem kind of humorless. He could seem ruthless. One of my favorite stories is one time this young officer had to do a presentation for Marshall and some of his assistants. And this was a promising young officer, and he gave the presentation, and it was just terrible. It was an awful presentation. And after the young officer left the room, Marshall turned to one of his assistants and said, "I thought this guy was an up-and-comer." And Marshall's assistant said, "Well, geez, General, he was obviously scared to death of you, couldn't you tell?" And that wasn't an unusual response to Marshall because he could be so intimidating sometimes. Marshall called everybody by their last names. Everybody called him General Marshall, except one guy. There's one guy who called Marshall by his first name, and that was Joe Stilwell. He was the only one who called him George. Everybody else called him General Marshall. So he just seemed like an intimidating man, but that's not really accurate. Marshall was actually a very kind man, and I have a couple of stories to illustrate his kindness. Each one I find more amusing than the one before. One example of Marshall's kindness is when he would be driving or have his chauffeur driving and they'd see soldiers, he would stop and pick up the soldiers and take them where they wanted to go. During the war, at one point, Marshall learned that the soldiers in Iceland had run out of beer. And Marshall understood how important beer was to soldiers, so he made sure that immediately 40,000 cases of beer found their way to Iceland. So that tells you something about him. One of the other things Marshall would do is whenever he would travel to a theater of war, when he got back, he would always make sure that the wives of the generals that he had met got an update on what their husbands were doing. And my favorite sub-story of that is there was one general, his name was Corlett, and he served in France during World War II, and he lost his command because he got sick. He was sent back home on a boat. When he got to New York City and got off the boat, there was a staff officer there from Marshall. Marshall sent this guy to this General Corlett and said, I've got a car for you. We put you up in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. General Marshall has brought your wife here from New Mexico. She's waiting for you in the Waldorf Astoria, which is good if they got along, maybe not so much if they didn't get along, but I thought that was nice. And finally, my favorite story of what a kind man Marshall could be is Marshall's quarters during World War II is at a place called Fort Myer in Virginia, and occasionally he entertained bigwigs, important people. And the problem is that when these important people would show up for these parties he occasionally threw, all the neighborhood kids would show up to gawk and to watch what's going on. And it got to the point where the kids were becoming a problem. They were interfering. Now, if Marshall or anybody like, let's say me, I'd just say to the MPs, get these kids out of here. What Marshall did is he got all the kids together and he organized them into a patrol that was supposed to help the MPs keep order in the neighborhood, which again is a touching thing to do. It's certainly nothing I'd do, but it's a touching thing to do. All right, so that's his personality. This is a guy who, again, on the outside looks like a formidable guy, but really beneath the surface, he was an honorable man. A second thing to keep in mind about Marshall that's going to play into his selections is this. He had his own particular leadership style. Now, I myself, I'm not a leader, but if I was a leader, I would study what Marshall did. And again, this is going to play into how he picked his subordinates. Let me give you some aspects of Marshall's leadership. Marshall understood that he couldn't do everything. Okay, he understood there's only so many hours in a day, that he couldn't do everything, so he didn't try. Okay, Marshall worked a regular schedule. He worked like an 8 to 6 schedule, and when he went home every night, he left orders. The only people who should be allowed to call him were the Secretary of War and President Roosevelt. Nobody else is allowed to call him. After hours, he refused to talk shop if ever a general visited him. He couldn't talk shop. One time, Patton tried to talk shop with Marshall, and Marshall lost his temper and told Patton to shut up. And what he usually did during the war is when he got home from work, he and his wife would pack a picnic lunch, and they'd go canoeing down the Potomac River. They'd stop somewhere, eat the picnic lunch. Sometimes they'd take in a movie. So he's not one of those people who worked around the clock. And he did that deliberately because he knew he only had so much energy. He was over 60, and he wanted to conserve his energy for important things, not all the stuff that comes up around the clock. Second thing Marshall did is he had a way when he worked that if you came, and these are specific orders he had, if Marshall was at his desk and somebody came to talk to him, okay, the order was you come into his door, you stand in front of his desk until Marshall finished doing whatever he was doing, because Marshall learned that, if you ever put aside a letter, back in the old days when people wrote letters, you never come back to it. So the orders were you stand there till he's done doing what he's doing. When he looks up at you, you're supposed to state your business, state why you're there, no chit-chat, no small talk. Marshall will give you a decision, then you leave so he can get back to what he's doing, which strikes me as a smart thing to do. Marshall Marshall also surrounded himself with very good people, gave them lots of authority to make decisions, and when they screwed up, he didn't scapegoat them. So he supported the guys who he had around them. And finally, the last thing Marshall did is Marshall deliberately worked to remove all emotion from any decision he made. And at one point he wrote Eisenhower, he said, you have a problem with me, you tell me the problem. Okay, don't hide it, just tell me what any problem is, because again, he knew how to remove emotion from the calculation, sort of like a Vulcan if you're a Star Trek person, which I'm not. All right, so during World War II, Marshall had the responsibility of choosing the guys who are going to lead the highest combat formations in the war. Again, the divisions, the corps, the field armies, the army groups, the theater commanders. It's his call. It's true that Franklin Roosevelt, as president, technically he could have made those decisions, but Roosevelt usually left Marshall alone to pick whoever he wanted. And Marshall took it seriously. He understood that an army was really no better than its commander, so he put a lot of thought into who should command in what place. And there are a number of criteria that Marshall used when he's deciding who's going to command this corps, who's going to command this field army. And let me give you some of the criteria that he used. First one, and perhaps the most important one, is Marshall cared about an officer's character. Character mattered to this guy. In 1944, a class of students in Virginia wrote a letter to Marshall. And the question these kids in Virginia asked is they asked him, how do you pick a general? And Marshall actually responded to this letter. And it was a thoughtful letter. It just shows you that he put some time and energy into thinking about it. And he wrote, quote, "The most important factor of all is character, which involves integrity, unselfish and devoted purpose, a sturdiness of bearing when everything goes wrong and all are critical, and a willingness to sacrifice self in the interest of the common good." And as the war goes on, though, he kind of redefined character. Character started to mean all that stuff, to be sure, but also a toughness and ability to win battles. As he put it in a letter to Eisenhower later in the war, he said, quote, "I wasn't so much interested in generals' tactical skills as I was in having sturdy, aggressive fighters who could stand up during moments of adversity." So character mattered to this guy. And this might seem commonsensical to people. Of course, character counts, but not necessarily. I've been a university professor for a long time, and I've served on lots of search committees where we look for new professors. And if I were to stand up on one of these search committees and say, you know what, I really think we ought to consider this candidate's character, my colleagues would throw a fit. Character doesn't matter. What's important is whether that person can do his or her job. That's what's important. Well, Marshall didn't buy that. Marshall believed that character mattered. He believed that character was fate. So more than anything else, character mattered. He wanted people who reflected the values that he had. Right? So that's one thing you look for. A second criteria that Marshall looked for when he's appointing his high-ranking officers, combat commanders, is this: education. Education mattered to George Marshall. Well, let me explain what I mean by that. One of the Army's accomplishments in the early 1900s is that it established an educational system. We take it for granted now. If you're in the Army today, you spend about a third of your time in school. That's what many officers do. They spend a huge amount of time in various schools. Well, it wasn't always that way. That's something that happened starting in the early 1900s. In the early 1900s, when the Army again created an educational system, which included dozens of different kinds of schools. Schools for infantrymen, schools for engineers, schools for medical guys, a whole bunch of schools. And the two most important were these two schools. There's one school, it's called the Command and General Staff School. It's in Leavenworth, Kansas, and it's a school for staff officers. This is where you learn how to help the top general, how to help him command his division or corps or whatever. And again, that's the Command and General Staff School. If you go there, you're usually a captain, you're in your late 20s, something like that. The other school is the Army War College, which now is, which back then was located in Washington, D.C. And this is a school for the best and brightest in the Army. If you're a colonel and you're in your late 30s and they got you pegged for a general, you go to the Army War College. This is a school that teaches you how to command large units. You learn how to run a division or a field army or something like that. And those are the two key schools. If you go to the Command and General Staff College, if you go to the Army War College, even today, that means you're an up-and-comer. Okay, that's somebody who's marked for greatness in the Army if you go to both these schools. And it mattered to Marshall that you did go to these schools because he believed that this is where officers all learned how to act from the same playbook. They all learned how to use the same playbook. So he valued that kind of education. And in fact, before he appointed somebody to a high-level combat command, Marshall would usually check. Okay, did this guy go to the Army War College? Did this guy go to the Command and General Staff School? They did. Okay, let's go ahead and give him that command. In fact, of the 38 men who held the top-level combat positions in the American Army in World War II, of the 38, all but 5 went to the Army War College. There's only one who didn't go to either the Army War College or the Command and General Staff School. Only one of those 38. And I know what you're thinking, who was it? The one guy who never darkened the door of the Army War College, never darkened the door of the Command and General Staff School, was a guy named James Van Fleet, who later went on to command the Army in Korea during the Korean War and is considered one of the great combat commanders, even though he didn't go to those schools. But again, education matters. Marshall would check that. Okay? He wants officers who were educated, meaning that they'd been preferably to both these schools. All right? I should also note, though, before I move on, that whether or not you'd gone to West Point didn't matter to Marshall. West Point is basically the school where you create the low-ranking officers, get a bachelor's degree, then you're commissioned as a lieutenant. Marshall didn't care if you didn't go to West Point. In fact, of those 38 guys, do I have a statistic here? 9 of them got their commissions from the ranks. 1 rose through the Oklahoma National Guard. 2 got their commissions through other military schools, like Marshall did. He went to VMI. So to Marshall, it didn't matter how you became an officer. What mattered is what you did once you were an officer. But again, education was a factor. A third thing, a third criteria that Marshall cared about when he's picking these high-level combat commanders is this. He cared about your birthday. Cared about your birthday. What do I mean? Well, when Marshall served in World War I, one of the things that horrified him was these old guys leading these combat units. You know, old guys in their 60s. So old guys leading those combat units. He said they're just not up to it physically. They're not up to it physically. They're not up to it mentally. He saw it in World War I. So when he was Chief of Staff, the head of the American Army in World War II, he made this deliberate decision. We need relatively young guys leading these units, guys in their early 50s. In fact, he said to one general who he considered too old, he said, quote, we have had to be absolutely firm in the question of age for command. Not only that, but we must go much lower in the age groups for division and corps commanders than we are now doing. Every bit of data that we receive from the fighting fronts clearly shows that this is a young man's war, except in rare instances and then only in the highest command. So he wanted young men, and again, by young, he meant guys in their early 50s. Indeed, of those 38 high-ranking combat commanders in World War II, the oldest one was a guy named Walter Kruger. He commanded the 6th Army in the Pacific. At the beginning of the war, he was 60 years old, and the only reason he got that job, by the way, was because Douglas MacArthur asked for him. Otherwise, Kruger probably would have spent the war training troops, so he was the oldest. The youngest one, incidentally, was J. Lawton Collins. He was a Corps commander. He was 45 when the war ended. No, I'm sorry, when the war started. The average age of these guys was in their early 50s. And Marshall thought that was still too old. He would have preferred to have it a little bit younger, but early 50s, much better than World War I. So again, your birthday mattered. Okay, when he's deciding who to appoint to these high-level commands, he wanted to know how old you were. All right? And finally, a last thing that Marshall took into consideration when he's appointing his high-level commanders is this. You got to have a sponsor. Okay, there's this saying that it doesn't matter what you do in an organization if people don't realize it. Okay, so Marshall was a big believer. Somebody's got to vouch for you. Somebody's got to sponsor you. And early in the war, it's Marshall himself. Okay, Marshall had some guys that he'd been keeping an eye on for a long time, guys that he's going to have faith in and give them combat commands. And some of these guys you've probably heard of. Eisenhower was a guy who was a Marshall protege. He'd been keeping an eye on Eisenhower. Courtney Hodges, J. Lawton Collins. There's this myth that Marshall had a little black book. Okay, supposedly he had this little black book where between World War I and World War II, he kept track of all these officers and said, oh yeah, this guy will be a great Corps commander. Well, it's a myth, and ever since Marshall has died, people have been looking for this little black book, and nobody's ever located it. And supposedly a few years ago, somebody actually found in Marshall's papers a little black book with officers' names in it. And people said, oh, finally, we found the little black book. We've been looking for this thing for 50 years. Well, it turns out what it was about each officer, but it evaluated how well they hosted a dinner party. So it's not really how well they commanded. It's just how well their dinner parties were. But despite the fact that there was no black book, he did have his proteges. But here's the thing, though. As the war went on, Marshall couldn't do that. He doesn't know everybody. He doesn't know these young guys coming up through the ranks. So what he increasingly did is he relied on the guys on the scene. So if you were a successful field army commander and you wanted a certain guy to command a corps division, he would pay attention to that. Okay? He never forced anybody to accept a subordinate that that person didn't want. And this is particularly true of Eisenhower. By the end of the war, Marshall gave Eisenhower carte blanche. He said, whoever you want, I'll bring him in. You want anybody in the Army as a field army commander or corps commander, you just tell me, I'll bring him in. As Marshall wrote to Eisenhower, he said, quote, you do not need to take or keep any commander in whom you do not have full confidence. So long as he holds a command in your theater, it is evidence to me of your satisfaction with him. The lives of too many are at stake. I will not have you operating under any misunderstanding as to your authority and your duty to reject or remove any man that fails to satisfy you completely. And the best example I can give this is there was an officer who Eisenhower really liked. His name was Giro. They were like brothers. And Eisenhower really wanted him to command a corps in France during World War II. The problem was that Marshall kind of had doubts about this Giro guy. He'd seen Giro in action, just wasn't all that impressed. I think the word he used was stale. But Eisenhower wanted him. And Marshall, by that point, had enough faith in Eisenhower, figured if he wants this guy, we'll give him the guy. So you need a sponsor. You need somebody to vouch for you. Either Marshall's got to know who you were, or Marshall's got to have faith in someone who's telling him, yeah, we need to get this guy. So those are four things, four criteria that Marshall would use when deciding who to appoint as his high-level combat commanders. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but there are also some things that you would think Marshall would care about in picking his high-level combat commanders, but he didn't. And I got four of those, too. Again, the things you would think he would care about, but he really didn't. And the first one is this, your background. Your background. Now, understand at this time the Army was a racist, sexist institution, so it's an institution full of white guys, so we're not talking about women, we're not talking about black folks or even ethnic folks that much. So the institutionalized racism and sexism of the Army limited the guys he has to choose from a bunch of white guys. But other than that, there's no evidence he ever penalized anybody because of your nationality, because of your ethnicity, or anything like that. Okay, for example, during the war, somebody wrote Marshall a letter complaining about a general saying, you know, this guy's German. Okay, why are you putting a German in command of American soldiers? We're fighting the Germans. To which Marshall responded, he said, quote, there's nothing remarkable of having high-ranking officers in our army of German stock. Well, when you think about that, that's troubling. We're fighting them. All right, but he didn't care. He didn't care about your background. That didn't matter to him. All right? A second thing Marshall didn't care about that you think he might, but he didn't. He didn't care about your position in all the Army's cliques. You know, the Army's like any organization. It's full of all these cliques. It's full of all these factions. And Marshall never took that into account. Okay, he didn't care if you came from the infantry or the armor or the cavalry or the engineers. He didn't care whether you were a Pershing guy or a Pershing's archenemy from World War I, a Peyton March guy. He didn't care about that. And the best example I can give you is there was an officer, his name was Milliken. And Milliken, his father-in-law was a guy named Peyton March, who'd been a World War I chief of staff, who'd been John Pershing's arch enemy. And of course, Marshall was a Pershing guy. So if Marshall was petty about such things, if he cared about your position in all these cliques, he would have sidelined this Milliken guy. But he didn't. Okay, Milliken got to be a corps commander. He lost the corps for other reasons, but it wasn't the fact that he was in the wrong clique. So Marshall didn't care about that. Right? A third thing, again, you'd think Marshall would care about, but he didn't, is combat experience. Marshall didn't care if you didn't have combat experience. Okay, he would appoint people to be field army commanders and corps commanders and division commanders, even if they didn't have combat experience. And think about it. Eisenhower never heard a shot fired in anger before World War II. Omar Bradley never heard a shot fired in anger before World War II. J. Lawton Collins never heard a shot fired in anger before World War II. Okay, he didn't think that combat experience was necessary to be a successful leader of these high-level combat formations. And this made him a distinct minority. Eisenhower, for instance, Eisenhower really cared. Eisenhower wanted guys under his command who had some combat experience. MacArthur was the same way over in the Pacific. Not Marshall, though. It didn't matter to him all that much. And even as the war went on and the Army started to accumulate a whole bunch of guys with lots of combat experience, it still didn't matter to Marshall. Towards the end of the war, at the Battle of Okinawa, the commander of the American 10th Army was a guy named Simon Bolivar Buckner. And this is late in the war, and by this time the Army had dozens of officers with plenty of combat experiences who could lead a field army. Buckner didn't have any combat experience, but Marshall gave him the job anyway. And Marshall gave him the job because he thought he was a good guy, he thought he had trained soldiers well, he deserves his shot at combat command, so he gave the 10th Army to Simon Bolivar Buckner, who, by the way, his dad was the guy who fought for the Confederacy at Fort Donelson. And Buckner was also killed at Okinawa, so, okay. In fact, of the 38 men who led the high-level combat units, 15 of them were deployed overseas, having not seen combat yet in World War II. So that's less than half got their jobs not having seen combat. Okay, so again, that's something you'd think he'd care about, but he didn't. And finally, a last thing that you would expect Marshall to care about, but he really didn't, is this: your personality. Oh, he cared about your character. Character mattered, but your personality didn't. Okay, Marshall understood that you can be a successful general with all different kinds of personalities. You can be withdrawn, you can be outspoken, you can be an intellectual, you can be more of an action guy. Okay, people with lots of different kinds of personalities can be successful combat leaders. Marshall understood that. And in fact, Marshall, which is also kind of surprising, he had a soft spot for eccentric people. Even though Marshall himself was a staid, upright guy, he had a soft spot for these eccentric people. And the classic example of this, of course, was George Patton. Okay, George Patton was a very eccentric. He's an eccentric guy, a really, really eccentric guy. But Marshall always had a soft spot for Patton. By the way, my favorite story about Marshall and Patton is that Marshall was thinking of sending Patton to North Africa to fight. And Marshall said to him, well, think about it, General Patton, but here are your, draw me up a plan, but keep in mind, here are our resources. This is what's available. And Patton drew up this plan that required resources that the Army just didn't have at that point. And Marshall lost his temper and basically told Patton, forget it, you're not going to North Africa. And Patton, of course, was shocked and appalled because more than anything else in the world, Patton wanted to shoot at people. So Patton called Marshall and made this groveling apology and said, of course, I'll be able to do it with the resources allotted. Let me have the job. And Marshall reluctantly changed his mind. And apparently when Marshall hung up the phone, he turned to the guy next to him and said, that's how you handle George Patton. So he didn't care about your personality. That wasn't a factor for him. All right, so that's 4 things that Marshall cared about, that he took into account. That's 4 things you'd think he might care about he didn't take into account, which leads to the final big question, which is, how did he do? Okay, how well did these 38 guys who led the top-level combat commands, how did they do? Did it work? Did Marshall do a good job selecting these guys to command these units? Well, I think there are 3 things that I can use to prove that it did work. All right? And the first thing that's evidence that Marshall did a good job is this: turnover rate. Turnover rate. Again, 38 men led the highest-ranking combat units, the highest-level combat units in the Army during World War II. And of those 38 men, 14 were removed from their jobs for one reason or another. So 14 of these 38 lost their jobs during the war. That's over a third. And you might think that's evidence that Marshall did a bad job. If a third of these guys lost their jobs during the war, Marshall must not have done a very good job picking these guys. Well, but when you take a closer look, that's not true. Of the 14 guys who lost their jobs, 6 of them were promoted to more important jobs. Okay, so you can hardly hold that against them. Guys like Patton was promoted, Omar Bradley was promoted. So 6 of them were promoted. Of those 14 guys, 3 of them lost their jobs because they became ill and had to go home. One of them, our buddy Simon Bolivar Buckner at Okinawa, was killed in action. So that's 5. 5 guys who were relieved of their command because of perceived failure on the battlefield. But even when you look at these 5 guys relieved of their commands because they supposedly failed on the battlefield, you can make a good argument that politics and personality really played a more important role for 4 of them. 2 of these 5 guys were fired by Mark Clark, which to me tells you more about Mark Clark than the guys who were fired. 2 of the 5 guys were fired by Courtney Hodges, who again tells you something about him. He was a field army commander. So that leaves 1. There's 1 guy in which it's clear he should have been fired. 1 guy who clearly failed on the battlefield. 1 guy who I've never read any historian try to defend his performance. He screwed up. He should have been fired and sent home. He was fired and sent home, and I'm sure you all want to know who it is. His name was Lloyd Fredendall. He commanded a corps in North Africa. He's the guy who was responsible for the American Army's defeat at the Battle of Kasserine Pass. Have you ever seen the movie Patton? When Patton comes driving into that town in North Africa to take over with the siren blaring, okay, you can see in the window this general who's leaving, getting ready to leave. That's Fredendall. Okay, but he's the only one. He's the only guy who I think every historian would agree this guy should have been fired. Okay, the other 4 who lost their job, you can argue it, and historians have argued whether they deserve to be fired or not. But what that means is that out of the 38 guys he appointed these high-level positions, only 1 clearly, obviously failed on the battlefield. And that's pretty impressive as far as I'm concerned. So that's 1 piece of evidence that he did a good job. All right, the second piece of evidence is this. It's what these guys said about each other. Okay, what all these high-ranking generals said about each other. And one of the things that really struck me when I read through all these guys' journals and their memoirs and that sort of thing is that most of these men had a lot of respect for each other. They were proud of each other. They thought that everybody did a pretty good job. And if you've got a whole bunch of people who are proud of each other, you don't have a lot of backbiting and a lot of trying to undermine people's post-war reputation, that says something. There are exceptions, of course. George Patton, for example, I don't know if you've ever read Patton's diary. Patton badmouths everybody. Okay, Patton hated almost everybody. Now, when he's face-to-face with these guys, Patton was a huge suck-up. Patton would always ingratiate himself, but in his diary, he badmouthed everybody. In the Pacific, there's a general named Robert Eichelberger. In his diary, he badmouthed people too. But they're the exceptions to the rule. Most of these guys, they're proud. They're proud of their commanders. They're proud of their fellow division commanders. They're proud of their subordinates. In fact, at the end of the war, Eisenhower had 4 field army commanders. Okay, these are units of like 250,000 men. And each of these field army commanders had about 4 corps under them. And Eisenhower talked to all 4 of the field army commanders, Patton and Hodges and Patch and Simpson, and asked them about their corps commanders. And all 4 of these guys said, I've got the 4 best corps commanders in the Army. And that speaks well, for all these guys to be proud of their subordinates, proud of their superiors. To me, that's evidence that Marshall did a pretty good job. And finally, a last piece of evidence that I think shows that Marshall did a good job selecting these guys is an obvious one. The Army won the war. They won the war. They beat the Germans, they beat the Japanese, they beat the Italians, and they won the war. Now, there are all sorts of reasons why you can argue why the Army won the war: superior logistics, superior firepower, troops were better trained, better equipped. But certainly one of the reasons has to be good leadership. Okay, you can have all sorts of advantages. If you have poor leaders, you can still lose the war. And people always talk about how the Army had so many resources that it was impossible for it to lose the war. Well, even if the Army had lots of resources, it could still have lost the war. But one reason why it didn't is, again, because of the quality of the guys that George Marshall appointed. Now, let me close with one last story about George Marshall. And I think it's my favorite story. It tells you a lot about George Marshall. After the war, this would have been when Queen Elizabeth was coronated. So it would be 1952, I think it was. And Marshall was invited to her coronation. I don't know what he was doing, but Marshall was invited to the coronation. So he flew to London, and he walked into, I assume, Westminster Abbey. And when he walks in, everybody starts standing up. And Marshall's he's looking around, and he starts looking around, looking for who everybody is standing up for. And then it turns out, supposedly, they were standing for Marshall. People just recognized this man, Nobel Peace Prize winner, great general, great Secretary of State, and wanted to give him that tribute of standing up for him, to him. And again, the fact that he was so surprised by this, to me, speaks well. I told this story years ago, and after I gave the speech, this woman said, well, I researched it, and they weren't standing up for him. They were standing up for some English lords. but I'm going to choose not to believe her because it's too good of a story. So, if you have any questions, I'm happy to hear them.
All right. Up there.
I can't promise to know the answer to all that.
My question involves the post-war period in the Marshall Plan. And the question is, as he first proposed it to the American public, how was it initially received? At what point did it get large amounts of support from the public?
I know that it's really not Marshall's handiwork. You know, it's the State Department guys who came up with it. Marshall gives his name to it. I don't know how much support there was for it at first. I do know that they marketed it not only as a way to help Western Europe, well, really all European countries. It was designed for all of them, including the ones that were under Soviet control. But it was also marketed as a way to help the American economy, because it would get businessmen producing stuff that these Europeans would buy with all that Marshall money. I know that Congress voted for it. I'm pretty sure the majority was solid, but I couldn't tell you specific numbers. It's an interesting question, though.
Tell us a little bit about loyalty in the ranks of the high ranks. I know Eisenhower was sometimes criticized for being slow to fire the loser of Catherine Pass because he was loyal to him.
Yeah, Fredendall, the obvious failure. He lost the battle, and he performed poorly, and Eisenhower did hesitate to fire him. Some of Eisenhower's subordinates, like Truscott, who's a high-ranking combat commander, became famous. They all said to him, "You got to fire this guy." And Eisenhower hesitated, but finally he pulled the trigger. But I should know, he learned from that. And Eisenhower never hesitated like that ever again. He learned that if the guy's not measuring up, you got to remove him. And also Marshall did prod him as well, that if this guy's not performing, you got to fire him. So early in the war, Eisenhower did take that kind of loyalty into account. But by the end of the war, if you're not performing, he'll easily fire you.
How did Marshall get along with King, who also had a fiery personality?
King was the chief of naval operations, the commander of the Navy during World War II. And King and Marshall, they're co-equal. Neither could order the other around because they're two separate branches of the military. But they're both members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this high-level committee that determined Allied or American grand strategy. And Marshall understood that there's no way that the United States can win this war unless the Army and the Navy cooperated. So he made a deliberate effort to get along with King. And the most famous story is at one point King came to visit George Marshall, and Marshall was busy with some foreign leader, and Marshall kept King waiting. And you don't keep Ernest King waiting. Ernest King was a guy, people joke that he shaved with a blowtorch. And Ernest King went storming out of Marshall's office and went back to his office, just cussing at Marshall. And when Marshall learned what happened, Marshall made a beeline to King's office and apologized to King, and then said to King, look, we cannot bicker over stupid stuff like this. We got to get along, or there's no way we're going to be able to win the war. So he got along with King because he had to. And it's the same with the British. You know, he got along with the British because he had to. He understood that you got to maintain these alliances, be it an inter-service alliance with the Navy, be it an alliance with the British. There's no way that you're going to win the war.
I have read that President Roosevelt vacillated over picking Marshall versus Eisenhower to be the Supreme Commander. And I have also read that Marshall took that as his boss had made a decision and he would follow it. And I think he was grossly disappointed. What do you think?
I think that is true. When it became clear that it was going to have to be an American to command the invasion of Europe, because the Americans would have be investing most of the resources, at first everybody figured it'd be Marshall. It's a big job, it should be Marshall. Marshall figured it'd be him. In fact, his wife started packing stuff up at their Fort Myer headquarters. Eisenhower figured that it would be Marshall. Eisenhower figured he's going to end up going back to Washington. But there were some important people who told Roosevelt, you've got to keep Marshall in Washington. John Pershing, wrote a letter to Roosevelt saying Marshall is just too important for a rinky-dink theater commander. He's got some congressman said the same thing to Franklin Roosevelt. And eventually Roosevelt decided on Eisenhower, and supposedly he said to Marshall, he said, I just can't sleep if you're not in town. That's how much respect that Roosevelt had for Marshall. And Marshall he never said anything, but apparently he was really disappointed he didn't get that job. Because it's a combat command, and he didn't get that job. He was disappointed.
Did Marshall know of the atomic secret, and if so, when did he find out?
I don't know when he did know about it. I don't know when he learned of it. There is a story that at one point Harry Truman, who was a senator for most of the war, Truman ran some committee that was trying to find military waste in the bureaucracy. And Truman was coming across all this stuff, this huge amount of money going into this black hole for this Manhattan project. And so Truman got a meeting with Marshall and said, what's going on here? I got this Manhattan, what are we spending all this money on? And Marshall said something to him, well, all those documents you have with you, you got to leave them here, and you can't say a word about this to anyone. And so he knew it by that point, I assume soon after it started, and he was in on it. He helped make the decision to use the atomic bomb. He was on that committee, so he was an integral part of the whole process.
That's a two-part question. 1919, World War I is over. What was Marshall's rank at that point? And 20 years later, 1939, what was his rank, and what did he do for those 20-year time period?
End of the war, I want to say a colonel, but he quickly was demoted back to a more reasonable rank because of the constriction of the post-war army. And in the interwar years, he did a variety of jobs. At one point, he ran the Illinois National Guard. I know he did that. He was in China for a while. And he was rising through the ranks. He ran into trouble when MacArthur became the chief of staff, because MacArthur didn't like Marshall. Marshall had been a Persian guy. And the story is that MacArthur said at one point, George Marshall's never going to be a general as long as I'm a general in this army. But of course, MacArthur was only chief of staff for so long, and supposedly that's why he was sent to Illinois to run the National Guard, just because MacArthur didn't like him. But once MacArthur left as chief of staff, the guys who followed MacArthur, that would be, shoot, I forget the guy's name, whoever the guy was who followed MacArthur as the head of the army, he was a Marshall booster and got his career back on track. I think he was a colonel until 38, and then he was appointed a brigadier general. And he was relatively young when he became chief of staff. And he became chief of staff in September of 39, and he was a major general by then. And that, of course, involved a promotion.
Who do you believe was Marshall's best choice as a leader? One question. And then I kind of thought about it and thought, who do you believe was Marshall's best choice as a leader, who was kind of a dark horse, who maybe he plucked out of the career?
An inspired decision would have to be Eisenhower. Just because Eisenhower, he wasn't a big, he was a respected man in the Army, but not really high up. But Marshall saw something in Eisenhower. He saw the organizational ability. He saw the keen mind that Eisenhower had. And most of all, Eisenhower could get lots of different people to work towards a common goal. And people often criticize Eisenhower because he wasn't a combat commander, he didn't understand tactics. Well, that wasn't his job during the war. His war, he was a coalition builder, he was a military manager, make sure that the British and the Free French and the Canadians and everybody's on the same page working towards a goal. Eisenhower was really good at that, and Marshall sensed that early on. For a dark horse guy, there's one guy, I have my favorites, and there's a commander of the Ninth Army, his name was Simpson. And he's considered, people who do a lot of this stuff will consider him one of the best generals. He never got the credit he deserved, but I've always had a soft spot for this William Simpson guy, partly because he almost flunked out of West Point, which I kind of feel for him there. So I'd say the Simpson guy is the one I like.
Probably going to throw you off a little bit on asking you this, but
when I was younger, I paid attention to obituaries, and specifically World War II obituaries. And I came across one day that just really floored me. And the gentleman, I can't remember his name now, but he was in the Doolittle raid. He was shot down, he was captured by the Japanese. He was tortured horrendously. And he was also liberated. But during his capture and the time of them putting him through horrendous torture, he asked the Japanese for a Bible. And they finally brought him a Bible, and he began to read the Bible, and he got to see his captors in a different light. So once he was liberated, he was brought back, home to the United States. He went to seminary and met his wife, and when both of them graduated, he went back to Japan and became a missionary in Japan. And one of his tracts that he put out all over Japan reached the leader of the raid on Pearl Harbor, and he was converted. He accepted the Lord as Savior.
Oh, you mean the guy who was leading the plane
that attacked Pearl Harbor. I don't think it was.
Right.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah, I've heard of that. I don't remember his name, but yeah, I've heard. And that guy became a big missionary in Japan too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering, because I was hearing some of the preliminary statements about you. You wrote on a person that was in the Doolittle raid, right?
No, it's not me.
Somewhere, that wasn't you? Well, have you ever?
Ask him.
He did? So have you ever considered looking into, like, some of that? And did MacArthur, did he have anything to do with the Doolittle raid? I mean, was he over it?
No, MacArthur was down in
Tell you when that Doolittle raid was conducted, and it's not his baby. That's more of a Navy, Army, Air Force thing. So no. And I don't know a lot about the Doolittle raid. It's never really interested me that much, so probably not.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
May I ask a second one?
Sure.
There was quite a tug of war for logistics supplies between the European theater and the Pacific theater within the Army. How do you see Marshall adjudicating the allocation of resources?
Well, within the
There
Army,
wasn't that much of a dispute because the strategy was Germany first, and the vast majority of the Army's resources went to the European theater. The struggle was more between the Army and the Navy because King and many naval officers wanted to avenge Pearl Harbor. They saw the war in the Pacific as their war, so they're always pushing for more resources in the Pacific. So that's the struggle. And Marshall, he was reasonable about, he supported an offensive against the Japanese. You had him on the run after Midway. He supported Guadalcanal and all that stuff. He supported the dual drive offensive towards Japan. But he still gave top priority to Germany, and that was American policy. Roosevelt had agreed to it, so he was reasonable about it, wanted an offensive towards Japan, but Germany still had most of the resources.
Since you're doing second questions, I have another one. Currently, the promotions in the military have been held up by Senator Tuttle from Alabama for many, many, many months. What is the impact of those delays in the day-to-day operation, as well as in the 30,000? How is that actually going to impact the military?
You mean right now?
Oh, I wouldn't know. I don't know how much trouble that causes. I assume it's some, but I wouldn't know for sure. Couldn't tell you.
What were Marshall's thoughts about the U.S. Army not going into Germany as the war wound down and letting the Russians do most of the damage in Germany and not moving U.S. troops in, like, say, Patton and Montgomery advocated for.
Yeah, Eisenhower made a
Decision in 45 not to advance towards Berlin. There's an opportunity there. You can make an argument that we could have gotten to Berlin first, but Eisenhower decided it wasn't worth it. We're going to have to give most of Berlin to the Soviets. That's part of the deal we've made to divvy up Germany. And Marshall supported Eisenhower. It's his call, and he supported Eisenhower as a man on the scene.
What do you think Marshall's thoughts were about the dropping of the atomic bomb?
There's some debate about whether Marshall thought an invasion of Japan was necessary. From what I've read, he thought it probably was. And so, I'm not an expert on Marshall and the atomic bomb, but everything I've read is that he did go along with it. And it's a way to try to end the war. It's got to be better than invading Japan, which looked like it would be necessary. So my understanding is that he supported it.
Any more?
What was the
The Army's
Archives are in
archives are in
Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where anybody can, even if you're a common soldier, you can send all your stuff there, and a lot of the general stuff is there, and that's where I did a lot of my research. So that's the best one. Now, you probably heard the story. A lot of the soldiers' official records are at this warehouse in St. Louis. There was this big fire there in 1973, and a lot of them were destroyed. A huge amount were destroyed, including some of the guys I looked at. But getting a look at those personnel files is really tough to do anyway. They're called the 201 files, so I probably wouldn't have been able to look at them anyway. And some of them are at Carlisle regardless, so that's the place to go. It's a nice place, too.
What was Marshall's thoughts on the Rangers? Was he for them or against them, and why?
I couldn't tell you. Little I've read is he accepted them. I don't know how enthusiastic
Was about them. I do know as the war went on, more and more of these guys saw these special forces as a diversion from, we need guys in the infantry. But I don't know, I guess it's a short answer, so I don't know.
Yeah,
I know Admiral Richardson thought good and bad about Admiral Leahy. One of the questions on one of the documentaries I watched the other night was how important was Admiral Leahy? How did he get through him to Roosevelt?
Yeah,
Marshall was the brains behind the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is this inter-service committee that came up with American Grand Strategy. It had 2 Army guys on it, George Marshall and the head of the Army Air Force, Henry Arnold, and it had 2 Navy guys on it, Ernest King, who was the Chief of Naval Operations, and then a retired Chief of Naval Operations named Leahy. And the reason why Leahy was there was so there'd be 2 Navy guys and 2 Army guys, so King would go along with this idea. And Leahy also served as the guy with the he'd chair these meetings. And he had access to Roosevelt. I don't know how much he contributed to the decisions in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but he was vital because he's their conduit to Roosevelt, and he balances out the Navy and the Army. That's my impression.
Among the top guys, Marshall, King, Leahy, who was Roosevelt's favorite?
That's a good question. My guess would be Leahy, because Marshall, I guess the word would be kind of intimidated Roosevelt, because Marshall wouldn't hang out with Roosevelt. One time, Roosevelt made the mistake of calling Marshall George, and Marshall clearly didn't like that. So Roosevelt didn't get along. He didn't see Marshall as a boon companion because Marshall didn't want that kind of relationship. He was always afraid that Roosevelt would, seduce him with whatever crazy-ass idea that Roosevelt had at the time. I don't know how well he knew the Army Air Force guy, Arnold. Roosevelt liked the Navy, but I've never read that he and King were particularly close. I'd say the one he was closest with was Leahy. I don't know how close they were. I know they socialized. So I'd probably say Leahy.
Any more? Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.
Let's see, I got a couple of things I need to wrap up on, if y'all don't mind. We're gonna send Stephen out to the front immediately for book signing. You can join if you want to while you're out there near the cash register. You can join the museum also if you wanted to. Turn in your printed insert if you don't mind, if you fill it out. If not, email it back to us later, we'll look at it then. If you wish to donate anything, we always appreciate it. Thanks again to A&M Commerce History Department for sponsoring the program. And our program next month will be from the other end of the spectrum, from a private's diary. Johnny Pierce's father, Frank, from Sulphur Springs, kept a really nice diary and wrote letters home from the time he hit North Africa to the time they surrendered in Germany. And it's a fun look at the other end of what's going on in World War II in the European area. But appreciate you all coming. I think we bingo tonight, didn't we? See you again.
This video has been brought to you by GEUS. GEUS is your community-owned provider for electric, internet, cable TV, and true local programming.